Hi, good morning. Welcome to this panel on India Rising. I am Sunjoy Joshi, your moderator for this morning session. And with me are three brilliant panelists. You'll hear them. My only regret is actually that somehow I'm presiding over a panel. There are no women here. So please, I encourage all the women in the room to ask lots of questions and grill them. So with me here are, first of all, Gunnar Wiegand, Visiting Distinguished Fellow, Indo-Pacific Program, German Marshall Fund. He's been writing, he's been teaching, he's been lecturing on India, China, Southeast Asia. So he knows it well. Then we have, of course, Satu Limaye. He is Vice President of the East-West Center and also serves as Director in the East-West Center on the Asia Matters for America initiative. We'll ask him about why Asia matters. And last but not the least is a former colleague of mine who's also been part of the government of India, Ashok Malik, who is partner and chair of the India practice in the Asia Group now which is a private consultancy come a think tank. So welcome all of you, and India Rising, and someone was asking me just now, India Rising, does that come with a exclamation mark, a question mark, or a full stop? What is it? Which of the three is it going to be? See, I'm not going to be giving you basically time to make opening comments. I'm going to be asking questions. I'm the only one who has the privilege of making opening comments. That is the chair's prerogative. Now, let me frame it. Let me try and frame. We've been since yesterday listening to a lot about the divisions, the fragmentations in the world, where the world is headed. But let me, in this panel, try to zero in dig a little deeper into what are these divisions and where does a country like India stand in the midst of these divisions. Very briefly, if you start looking at the divides, there are three very clear divides I see in the world today. And they're actually going back into the past. The world has, in many senses, moved back 50 years, 30 years, 60 years into a world which existed in the last century. The first is, yes, we have resurrected the Iron Curtain. European security has become a major question today. And it's not just resurrected, it is an Iron Curtain which I think is now reinforced with steel. It's a much stronger Iron Curtain. The second is, there's this bamboo curtain which now the world feels should never have been parted. The world should never have started trading with China. And get that curtain back. Cut it off. Try to get back into that old world. Third, much more serious divide, and I think which matters even more, which Prime Minister Olaf referred to yesterday also in the panel, is the North-South divide. Now, we talk of the festering war in Ukraine. We talk of the happenings in Gaza all the time. The war continues in Gaza. Long drawn-out conflicts which do not seem to be having any end, where the warring sides seem to have taken extreme pole positions, where they do not want to meet. There's no common meeting ground. Now, in this kind of a situation, there is a fear, and the fear was expressed by Prime Minister yesterday, that somewhere the North is losing the global South. So this divide is not the old North-South divide, which was actually a divide more of economic development or where they were on the development trajectory path. It is a much more serious divide. It has become a divide of discourses. It's become a divide of values, of meaning. We are perhaps even on different paths. So I actually rate that as one of the most serious divides in the current century. So we have these three divides. In some ways, they are resurrections of old divides. In many ways, they are new divides only possible in the 21st century post the end of globalization. So to my panelists now, quick questions. Satu, you began with this, you wrote in the Bled Strategic Review. We all read that article. Many of the people have read that article. You said, talk about India's incredible internationalism in this situation. Now, my question to you is very simple. Is that a backhanded compliment? What does incredible mean? I mean, not credible, a part of fantasy, a dream. The first question I asked, India rising, full stop, exclamation mark, or a question? What is it?
Well, thank you, Sunjoy, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and for the invitation from the Strategic Forum here in Bled. You asked a very provocative question straight off, so I'll get down to it. First of all, I stole the idea of India's incredible internationalism from India's own tourist motto, which is Incredible India, minding the poet's advice that immature poets imitate, mature poets steal. And so I'd like to acknowledge my theft.
Yeah.
I don't think it's incredible because it's fantasy. I think India's internationalism is actually far more complicated than the three divides that you've laid out. And that's because India's material interests are laid out, if you map them out over the world, betray or suggest or manifest an incredible strength, fifth largest economy in the world, number 1, 2 population, significant military and technological and other capabilities that you all know of, we don't need to repeat, significant suboptimal achievements in all of these areas, and most markedly, diffusion. What I mean by that is everywhere matters to India because India doesn't rely on any one place to provide most of its material returns. So you can look at this in investment, you can look at this in trade, you can look at this in the way it purchases military equipment, you can look at it in the way that India straddles BRICS, SCO, G7, G20, the Quad, bilateral arrangements, etc. In other words, India's internationalism is incredible precisely because, as I always say, India is not a bridge. Forgive me, I come from a civil engineering background in the family, so India is not a bridge, it's an interchange. And what is an interchange in transportation dynamics? It's different gradients which offer multiple pathways to get over obstacles. And so India's incredible internationalism affords its ability to navigate between the US and China, between Russia and China, between greater powers, between multilateral institutions. And that is, in my judgment, what makes India incredible. It's an even-handed compliment.
Gunnar, let me get to you now. And precisely, I want your reaction on that, what Satu said. Is that the perception in Europe today? That is where India stands? You can think of these three divides, you can think of many other divides in the world, but where India stands today, what are the perceptions, what are the apprehensions, what are the hopes, what are the fears?
Thank you for this opportunity, and I have to say that I speak not only as a think tanker or professor now, but until 1 year ago I was EU official and in charge of Asia-Pacific policy of the EU. So I had the opportunity to deal with India repeatedly. And what Europe is looking for is, of course, credible internationalism of India. We believe in the continuing rise of India. And I would like to go back to a meeting which I told you about we had a few years ago in New Delhi of all our ambassadors in the Asia-Pacific region, where we had a guest speaker called Tony Blair. Now that there is a new government in London, one can again quote Tony Blair. And he got the question, which will be the powers in a multipolar world which count in 2050? And he said, well, China will certainly be there, the US will certainly be there, Europe, we must make every effort, but India will also be there, and very strongly so. So that's what we believe in, and that's what the Indians believe in. What at surface everybody sees is a thriving democracy, is a highly pluralistic country, highly diverse, and the largest democracy of the world, which just had its elections, which believes also in a world system with multilateral rules which should be the same for all. Well, that is something fundamental which we share as Europeans very much with India. And the question is whether India would like to reshape those multilateral rules and in which way. And the question is whether India feels closer to the one or the other of the other poles. And here I would like to quote, and sorry for being a former official who likes to quote documents, but as recently as last year when we created the Trade and Technology Council with India, between EU and India, and that's the only other partner with whom we have this beyond the US, the ministers with the leaders' agreement said, as vibrant democracies, open market economies, and pluralistic societies, the European Union and India share fundamental values and have a common interest in ensuring security, prosperity, and sustainable development in a multipolar world. Both sides emphasize the importance of the rules-based international order, full respect for the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, transparency, and peaceful resolution of disputes. That sounds great. We love it. But then there are sometimes doubts to which degree India is really fully attached to this. When we see how India has reacted to the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, with some form of equal-handed approach, with a way of not criticizing Russia openly, neither in the United Nations voting, nor certainly with any sanctions. The fact that Prime Minister Modi visited in July President Putin and embraced him and did not openly criticize him, at least in public. That was something of a major concern for our side, because we see that the international order is at question here with an aggressive behavior which must be clearly denounced. And the fact that, as you already pointed out, you are at the same time in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with Russia and China, and you are enlarging the BRICS with partners such as Iran, that you can do this while you are also in the Quad. That's something which for European thinking is quite difficult to get accustomed to. But of course, we have to respect the choices which are being made by this partner, India. We have now engaged in this new Trade and Technology Council, but we also engaged in very significant negotiations on an FTA and several other trade agreements. And let me finish by saying that the economic potential of India is, of course, huge. The growth performance was the most significant over the last couple of years when compared both to ASEAN and to China. But there's a long way to go. And I would like to recall that while India is now the 5th largest economy, that means after the US, China, Germany, and Japan, India will certainly soon be the 3rd largest economy, but we have to look at the GDP in total compared to the EU. It means that we have a population in the EU which is only 1/3 that of India, but is 4 times the GDP of India. And therefore, the key challenge in India remains in terms of GDP per capita, in terms of the possibilities for the individual to advance, in terms of the inequalities in the country, and in terms of the possibilities to achieve an economy which is much less informal and much more formal and has opportunities for everybody. This is something where Europe sees itself as an important partner for diversification and for economic growth of India. And increasingly, we also are building up a political and a security-related partnership.
Thanks, Gunnar. You've done my work. and laid out the field. It's getting interesting. Laid out the field for both Ashok and Satu to respond to. And I would like both of you to pick up some of these pieces. Ashok, let's start with this very controversial issue about, as far as Europe is concerned, India's stance towards Russia, India's trade with Russia. Okay, India's growing and burgeoning trade with Russia. Let's talk about Modi's. Tell me your perceptions about Modi's visit to Russia, to Ukraine, and to Warsaw. What was achieved? How much was it was just optics? And what is it that India is hoping to achieve through some of this diplomacy? It's internationalism.
Okay, thanks, Sanjay. And yes, Gunnar has laid down a whole list of issues to which I could add my bit or respond. But I'd like to begin by thanking the Bled Strategic Forum for inviting me here. I hope I'm invited again next year because the city is just beautiful. Let me begin by responding to your original question. What sort of rise is India's rise? It's a rise that does not need an adjective. I would say it does not need an erroneous advertising slogan that is at odds with the substance of the product, which is the case with at least one other country. It's not a revisionist bar. It's trying to restructure the international order to accommodate today's realities. Now, coming to India and Russia, which is the question you raised, let's take a slightly broader view here. Slovenia, this part of the world, and India are at two ends of this vast space, this vast continental space called Eurasia. You deal with the western end of Eurasia, we deal with the eastern end of Eurasia. Believe me, if you think the western end of Eurasia is complicated, you haven't seen the eastern end of Eurasia. That's even more complicated. Russia is, I recognize, a challenge and a problem here. Sometimes Russia is a part of the solution there because our bigger threats are from radicalism, from China. So we sometimes need to do tactical arrangements there with countries such as Iran, such as Russia, which actually work to everyone's benefit. But these are tactical, not strategic. Now, coming to India's relationship with Russia, look, this is a historic relationship. It's a legacy relationship, but it's a relationship that will never completely go away. But if a country's foreign policy is a bag of multiple weights, I would say the ball that represents Russia, the Russia weight, as it were, is declining both in relative terms to the other weights and in absolute terms. But it will never reach zero. It cannot, simply because of our geography. A lot of foreign policy, a lot of diplomacy, a lot of international relations is a function of one's geography, as it is for Slovenia as well, or for this part of the world. Now, does that mean that there is much substance to India's economic relationship with Russia? Let me take you back to a period before COVID and before the invasion of Ukraine. And I am happy to call it an invasion. Nobody in India calls it anything but an invasion. We recognize Russia invaded Ukraine. Nobody in India, including the government, is happy with that invasion and has said so. In the period just before the year 21-22, just before the war, India's trade with Russia amounted to $13 billion. In the same year, India's trade with the EU was about $150 billion. Trade with the US was about $130 billion. Trade with China was over $100 billion. Those numbers should tell you something. It should tell you about where we see our future, where we sell our goods and services, where we buy from. Today, India's trade with Russia is $65 billion. But 55 billion of that 65 billion is Russian crude oil being sold to India, being refined in India, and then being sold to other countries, including Europe, including the United States. As per an arrangement agreed to by all major powers, including Europe and the US, adhering to a price cap, and a recognition of the reality that there simply isn't enough energy in the world for all of us. And if Russian energy goes off the market, crude oil prices will be close to $180 million a barrel. Now, why did this arrangement happen at all? It happened because as soon as Ukraine was invaded, as soon as Europe decided it would not buy energy from, or tamp down on energy from Russia, countries such as Germany, very understandably, went into the global market, went into the spot market, and completely distorted the spot market with money. And understandably, everyone needs energy for the families back home. This led to our traditional energy suppliers, India's traditional energy suppliers in the Middle East, in the Gulf, ramping up prices and selling to Europe. It's not that there was some new energy coming from Mars. It's the same energy in the world. So we had to turn to other sources, and Russian oil became available on the high seas because suddenly contracts that Europe had begun were not being honored, so it became available. It was an opportunity. But it was not profiteering. It was an opportunity used to ensure that oil prices did not go over the roof and completely destabilize the global economy. This does not mean there is no sympathy for what is happening in Ukraine. Of course there is. But the impact of this war on fuel prices and food prices and fertilizer prices, which is related to food, is significant. And therefore, major countries in the world, including India and its partners, such as the US and Europe, have found a compromise mechanism, which may not sound nice in public, but the fact is, it's helping all of us. Russian crude oil being refined in India is turning up in Europe. You're using it. So why just blame India? Coming to Prime Minister Modi's visit to Russia and subsequent visit to Ukraine, look, India doesn't see itself as a peacemaker or a mediator. We don't have delusions of grandeur. We can carry messages, we can point to possible solutions. Prime Minister Modi is one of the few global leaders who can visit both countries with some degree of credibility. There are other leaders who could visit both countries but are either trusted in one and not in the other, or are doing this, such as in the case of Turkey, for their own leverage. India is not doing it for leverage. We are not part of this region. If we can help nudge people towards a solution by simply opening up a communication channel, we'll be happy to do so. Have we done this in the past 2 years? When there was concern in the West about a nuclear option being exercised by Putin, India was asked to deliver a message, and it did. When there was the blockade, which had to be lifted to allow Ukrainian food grains to move out, India again carried messages and helped that blockade to be sort of softened. So we've done this before, but we've done this for tactical or limited outcomes, not to end the war. Like we don't believe we can end the war. How can the war end? And is something for, frankly, Russia to consider and Ukraine and Europe to consider. That's a separate matter. We can only nudge people in a certain direction, but that, in sum, is how India sees this war.
Thanks, Ashok. Satu, taking off from that, from where Ashok left. Now, India's kind of diplomacy, which you call India's internationalism, straddling these this alphabet soup of organizations, SCO, BRICS, a whole host of others which it is part of. There are, yes, questions raised in Washington, there are questions raised in Brussels about what India is trying to do. Some would say India is going back to its time-tested position of non-alignment or strategic autonomy. How do you see it? Is it really that, or this is very different today from what you saw at the time of the Cold War?
Excuse me. Let me come at the question from an American point of view. Obviously, it's the only point of view I can represent, which is, in some sense, I'm struck nowadays by the similarities between the Indian and United States approach. What do I mean? Because it explains some of these issues on some of these fronts. First is a somewhat calibrated view towards focusing on domestic and internal issues, primarily, first and foremost, rebuilding America's strength. You've seen all the Build Back Better legislation that we have in the United States Congress. You've seen all the focus on bringing manufacturing, reshoring, whatever you want to call it. So I don't think that's extraordinarily different in impulse and intention from India's self-reliance or strong India ambitions. Second, I think the United States also sees a need to move away from some of the, my colleague Gunnar mentioned European views on internationalism and multilateralism. I think there is support, of course, for the post-1945, as it were, rules-based order or et cetera. But I do think there's some revisionism going on in the US too. That aligns not insignificantly with India's approach to sort of revision, but also keeping rules-based order and elements of rules-based order with adaptations and revisions to adapt to the changing times. Third, I think where we differ, and this is quite a complicated issue, is really currently on Russia. And to some extent, despite the seeming alignment on China, some differences in approach there, which we can get to. I know there's an Indo-Pacific panel that follows, and there's a Pax America panel on the other side of the wall. I'm very conscious listening with one ear to what they're saying about Pax Americana. But I think there are some alignments. Now, I don't see India in non-alignment. As I've written in the piece, my view is that India's approach towards non-alignment was overly focused, not India's policy. Observers, such as myself, analysts, overemphasize the deltas or the gaps between India's alignment with great powers. Was India close to Moscow? Was India close to Beijing? Was India close to London or Brussels or Washington? To me, that was less important in more I think about it, than how much and how India wanted to be involved in the world. So India's even conceptions of non-alignment were adaptive. It was non-alignment until the Cold War ended because there were two poles. It became strategic autonomy when the Cold War ended and there was the looming US hyperpower. And now there's a focus towards self-reliant India, strong India, so I think non-alignment has itself evolved, changed, adapted, both to domestic circumstances, needs, ambitions, as well as global ones. And the final thing I'll say on this is today I think India is what I would call poly-aligned. It's aligned on multiple places simultaneously, as we keep discussing. It has good relations with Europe, it has good relations with powers, it has lesser or greater relations even with China or with Moscow or with other countries. I think second, there's an element of populism in India, which is not unknown in Europe, and it sure as heck ain't unknown in the United States. So there's a certain element of populism. And the final element of India's approach to so-called non-alignment now is what I call coalitional plurilateralism. In other words, India is in a position in this fragmented, deconstructed, revising and adapting world to create coalitions of interests where its needs are met. And I think that's an extraordinary ability to navigate this international system. It depends on much greater internal power and carefully navigating shocks to the system, like Russia's invasion, like China's behavior in the Indo-Pacific. But it's still pretty adaptive. So if you think about India being able to navigate the Quad, eventually, potentially join on to NATO IP4, eventually still be in SCO and expanded BRICS, et cetera. This kind of coalitional plurilateralism, sometimes we call it a la carte multilateralism, is really India's menu. And it puts India, in my judgment, in this new evolving international order in a pretty good space. And for my country's interests, makes it possible for the United States to deal with India simultaneously in the Quad while having significant differences, whether it be on Russia or other issues. And that's different from the past. It's not zero sum. And that allows the US also to work with India in ways that we couldn't work with India before. And don't forget, in our country, the domestic element is there is no debate on whether to have good relations with India. Not Republican, not Democrat. There are nuances about whether you put Russia as the biggest threat or China as the biggest threat. But there's no fundamental US debate on whether we should improve relations with India.
Could I just...
Oh, yes, come in.
You know, we can debate endlessly about whether India is multi-aligned, non-aligned, poly-aligned. In the end, these are words, to be honest. Okay? We all use them. But I would say a country can only be as non-aligned or as internationalist or non-internationalist as its economy allows it to be. Let's go back to 1991. I'll leave you with just two statistics. 1991, when India began to open up its economy. India's GDP at that point was $275 million, okay, a quarter of a trillion. 15% of India's economy at that point was came from global trade. So $40 million worth of global trade, $40 million, that's it. Today, India's economy is close to $4 trillion, and about 45 or 47% is from global trade. So about $2 trillion is global trade, which means the prosperity of the average Indian family is far more affected or impacted by global trade in some way or the other than was the case in 1991, which also means that a war in faraway South America between pro-Russian and pro-American guerrillas would have left India cold and non-aligned in the 1960s. Somebody else's war, we can stay non-aligned. Today, with increasing business links between India and South America, in fact, business links between India and South America are ahead of political links. Okay. We cannot afford to be non-aligned. So we have a stake in. So in some senses, the evolution of Indian foreign policy or the increasing internationalism in our discourse is reflective of our economy and our economic growth. And the second point I'd like to make is, you talk about, both of you spoke about India straddling both Quad and SCO and BRICS, or G20 and many such institutions and platforms. In some senses, we have an alphabet soup out there in the global system. Everyone's trying out every possible platform. Some will survive into 2050, some won't. But in some senses, there's one common thread for all of India's concerns, challenges, opportunities, sense of competition, sense of cooperation. And that common thread is China. It's the country we haven't spoken. We spoke about Russia, America, Europe. We haven't spoken about China. If India is part of Quad, it's in some senses a response to China. If India is a part of SCO and BRICS, it's also there because we don't want that space occupied only by China, whether it's Central Asia or the Global South. And if India walks away from SCO today, which country will be the happiest? It will not be a European country. It will not be the United States. It will be China. It will be ecstatic. Because, let me give you one factoid.
No, thanks, Ashok. We'll come back. We'll come back to China again. But let me now let Gunnar butt in. Gunnar, let me add one comment. We heard Satu, and he called both India and the US revisionist powers. Not happy with the current status quo. Now, adaptive powers. Now, my question to you, and of course, please respond to what both of them said, that you definitely do. But my added question to you is going to be, is the EU becoming a status quoist power in the face of these revisionist powers? I'm talking of the EU. But within the EU, when you start talking about different countries, many countries within the EU also want to be revisionist because they want their domestic priorities to get as much weightage when they deal internationally with other countries. So is this the state of the world where we are today?
it's very, I mean, you were startling me when you were saying that, when you were comparing the US to India, and that US is the anti-status power like India, a revisionist power. While the rest of the world thinks that the system which we have after 45 is a US hegemonic system, to quote many who are commenting on the influence of the US. That is an analysis which I would not share. I think the revisionism of the US depends, of course, who would become next president of the United States. We would have either a status quo and a certain reform readiness for the international system in the case of the Harris win, but we would have indeed a unilateralist, make America great again approach, which doesn't care much about the international system. That's true. India foreign policy is perhaps about make India great again, and use all possible means for that. And if you want, are the Europeans the status quo? Well, the fact that we are in this beautiful country here, which was part of socialist Europe and was part of a dictatorship, the fact that we have a majority of member states in the EU who have been dictatorships in the present or previous generation, the fact that we have no war between us, is all linked to European integration. And we are preparing for a next wave of enlargement to bring the prosperity and the peace project further. What is interesting when you work for Europe around the world, that the great majority of countries in the world want exactly that. They want to have stable, predictable international rules which give them the same rights as other states. We are always looking at US and China and perhaps a bit of Europe and India, and that means the poles who are influencing the world. But the great majority of states want to have exactly the same rights, small or big, and that right is not created by might. And this is exactly how the European Union functions itself. So it is, I guess, natural, it's in our DNA, that we are working for the same approach to international relations as we have managed to do between our own states. In this sense, yes, we are perhaps a status quo power, but we know that the great majority of countries in the world share this. And we have not given up the hope that India also wants to have rules you can rely upon in the interaction between states, and that it is not military power which would decide. Let me finish by referring back to the many, and it's interesting, the reasoning which was given by Ashok, whether it's Quad, SCO, or BRICS, the reason is China. I guess that the natural, most coveted position for India is that of the leader of the global south. And our Chinese partners were not particularly happy about the success of the term global south. We didn't use this term a few years ago. This was essentially promoted by India in the run-up to the G20 presidency by India. And India sees itself as the most vocal representative of those who aspire to rise further and who want to have their fair share. And we Europeans are not at all against that kind of notion, on the basis of the same rights and the same obligations for everyone. And we hope that ultimately India will also be part of that camp.
Sunjoy, can I come in on one thing about adaptation and revision? I don't want to say India and the United States, and you speak in shorthand at a conference, is the same kind of revision. India wants to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, which is, to me, joining the club that is the rules, part of the rules-based order of post-45. The US clearly has soured on what the WTO system did in terms of fairness vis-a-vis China. It's soured on the notion of kind of multilateralism in the old style. It's soured on the idea of large, multiple country free trade agreements. It's soured on the notion that there shouldn't be more flexibility in providing public goods in the Indo-Pacific region. So in that way, it's adapting both to structural changes and domestic changes about these issues. And in that way, there are more in what the essence of my comment about some similarities between the US and India. I think, as I've argued before elsewhere, that there is more space for the US and India to cooperate because their approaches towards a changing international order are more aligned than they have been in previous phases of the international order. And I think we're getting more distinct from the kind of Europe you're describing, because this is part of, are we moving away from the UN system? I don't think even under, you'll recall that our former President Trump, now candidate Trump, appointed an ambassador to the United Nations. We participated there during that administration. I don't see that changing under either administration. But I do think there is a very deep and fundamental questioning whether the institutions of 45, aside from the official language, are the right ones, and where there is scope and room to adapt and revise to meet the needs of the United States and the international system in ways that weren't envisioned before. And I think that's not going to go away under either administration. I would just note that candidate Harris, Vice President Harris, came out this morning, yesterday morning, last night, whatever it was, against the steel deal in Pennsylvania, the Nippon steel deal. Now, if there aren't two candidates more aligned on such things with our #1 US ally in Asia, I just see these as signs of kind of alignment on how to think about FDI, foreign direct investment, how to think about trade, that are really quite developing a consensus around. And I think they're quite different from the views of 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 10 years ago.
Okay, let me now get to the other part of it, and this continues from where we left off, the Global South. And Gunnar made that statement that India aspires for leadership of the Global South. My question to you, Ashok and Satu, is, can anyone be a leader of the Global South? It is too diverse a group of economies. Is it about leadership, or is it about trying to give a voice? It is ultimately a question of that multipolarity we all speak of different powers. What is it that is happening when you talk of the North-South divide?
So if I could take that, Sanjay, it's a very good question. I don't think any country can aspire to be the leader of the Global South. I don't think 150-odd countries of the Global South are willing to have India or China or Tanzania as their leader. They are all sovereign countries. They have their own sense of identity and nationalism. They want to be their own people. That's completely understandable. What India aspires to be and has, to some degree, successfully demonstrated is that it can be a bridge between the Global South and broadly the West, which is what it did with G20. And you must see the context of India's G20 presidency and the context of the Global South narrative that India pushed. It took place post-COVID, when the Global South felt, frankly, cheated, because vaccines did not reach many countries in the Global South, including Africa, to this day, as quickly as they reach many other countries. The Ukraine war, added to the economic crisis that was the legacy of COVID. It led to food security challenges exacerbated by extreme weather events and climate change. The energy crisis, which I referred to earlier, these were all concerns that were building to bubble under the surface. And they were causing consternation in many countries of the Global South, which were speaking to us in India, perhaps more than our friends in the West, and really asking, is there something in this global order, global system for us? Or is G20 just a meeting of the 20 biggest economies of the world, the fat cats of the world, including India, who come together to discuss issues that don't concern the rest of us, who talk finance rather than economy and development. And that is the major shift which India tried to accomplish with its G20 presidency in partnership with its Western friends, including here in Europe and the US. And quite honestly, if we had not done that collectively, facilitated by India, it would have led the countries of the Global South asking, is there anything for us, any stake for us in the institutions as they are today, whether it's the multilateral system, whether it's the G20. And maybe the Chinese alternative is more inviting. So we are not leaders of the Global South. We are just ensuring the Global South remains more aligned to our values, Western values, Indian values, democratic values, and that we can demonstrate a developmental model within the broad rules of democracy and transparency.
Satu, would you see the expansion of the BRICS, the expansion of the G20 also in the same light? That is why this is happening, because of this rising need for multipolarity, with multiple posts coming in, which do not get as credible a voice in the current global system.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer for why Iran is in the BRICS or other countries choose to join these various organizations. I'd let them speak to that. At least from an American point of view, the Global South discussion doesn't quite have not surprisingly, doesn't have quite the salience because sort of the US approach is perhaps a bit different. To the extent that the Global South has really come up in the American discussion, the less developed world, the non-Western world, it's come up in sort of 3 or 4 ways. One, it's come up in the way, I think to some extent, a little bit of surprise on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A little bit of a surprise in the US how many countries around the world have very mixed views, very mixed reactions, policy responses to that. The second issue, perhaps even far more important, is in the US is a discussion about how the rest of the world has responded to the rise of China and China's BRI and China's external diplomacy and China's ability to create new relationships, whether they be in Africa or Asia or Latin America, South America, et cetera. So that's the second vector through which, the prism through which America has seen kind of this non-Western developing world. And the third vector, I think, is, again, this issue of revision and adaptation, which is, if this is what's going on, I really, one of these mantras in US policy that I've never particularly cared for, who lost X, who lost Y, who lost the South, who lost India, who lost China, et cetera. I'm not a big fan of that narrative, but kind of, well, if this is what's happening, if many of these developing countries are responding this way to Russia's invasion, if many developing countries are so open to China's BRI and et cetera, what should be our policy response? And that's the third vector. And here I think efforts to develop new ways of engaging developing countries is very much on the table. And I have to say, Quad is part of that. It's a very tiny, small part. But how do we provide public goods in the region when we can't do a BRI type system? How do we use the Quad to do vaccinations and public health? How do we do it to provide infrastructure? How do we do it to provide security elements, et cetera, maritime domain awareness? So I think those are the 3 vectors through which we see it. I don't think there's any discussion about wanting to lead or can lead or who should lead. Rather, what is the proper policy response? And that is predicated on sort of a little bit of kind of the rest of the world treats these meta events very differently from how we're seeing them. Why? And what can be done about it to maintain US interests?
I think what we'll do is open up for questions. I have a whole lot of other questions, which maybe I'll try and get back to, because we haven't even touched this very vexed issue of trade and trade wars, which we thought we would cover. But we are running out of time, so let me take a break here and have questions Yes, ladies first. Young leaders, anyone first? I have to give priority to our young leaders. Then we come back to the lady there. Okay, the lady in the green scarf.
Thanks so much. India was quite prominent in the anti-apartheid struggle. India was one of the first countries that introduced economic and diplomatic sanctions against apartheid. South Africa, at a UN level, it was part of the UN's Special Committee on Apartheid at a time when a lot of Western countries wouldn't join. E.S. Reddy, who was an Indian diplomat, played quite an important role, at the UN level in those movements. But yet, fast forward today, we see when it comes to apartheid Israel, India takes a very different posture towards Israel. And I wonder to what extent, is that posture influenced by Islamophobia and the way in which India treats its Muslim population?
Oh, great, I love that question. See, the global south is not one. Many voices. Who will respond?
So, look, let me be very clear. Israel is a very important friend for India. The Palestinian movement is part of India's DNA. And in India, believe me, it is not seen as a Hindu-Muslim issue. It might be by a small minority, but among the most fervent advocates of the Palestinian cause in India, I know, are actually non-Muslims. Why is that so? Because we see the Palestinian cause as flowing from the same colonial inequities that emerged in our world, in our part of the world, post-World War II. So a two-state solution with equal rights for Palestine, with an independent and stable Palestinian nation state, is something which is written into India's foreign policy posture, and that is immutable. Indeed, as our relations with Israel have grown over the past few years, so has our assistance program with the Palestinian authorities. In fact, India's assistance to Palestine, even in the past few years, has grown manifold year after year. You can look at the numbers. It's absolutely true. So, two things have happened, if you want me to give an honest answer. Post the steps taken in the 1990s, late 1990s, and the early 2000s towards a two-state solution, the issue of Palestine, very unfortunately, dropped off the global map. It is unfortunate, but it happened. It happened because, to some degree, the authorities who took charge of Palestine after the elections did not rise to the occasion. The leadership was not up to it. And I guess there was a bit of fatigue with the issue, and it just dropped off. Post-October 7th, which was a terrorist attack, and I'm not defending it at all. But post-October 7th, the Palestine issue is back on the international landscape. It is not going to go away. It is not going to be bottled up again. We need a two-state solution. We need an end to this current conflict. And yes, it will probably not satisfy everybody. No solution does. But we need to work very seriously towards a Palestinian state. That is India's position, irrespective of which government is in power, irrespective of what our internal debates are.
Yes, please. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Thank you very much for an exquisite panel. My question is, you have this alphabet soup of organizations you appeal by. You have SCO on a sort of counterfactional thing to Quad on the foreign policy level. But how does this match the military level of fighting China in the Himalayas since 1962? Thank you.
She's talking of the Indo-China War in 1962 and the multiple alignments which India now has, of which China too is a part. What is India's real security stance on China? And military. What is the security stance?
Sorry, I have to answer that again. Okay.
It is a tough one, yes?
You see, between 1962 and about the late 1980s, as a result of the War of 62, India didn't have.
The most recent event in the Himalayas.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, just give me a moment, I'll come to that. Between those 3 decades, we didn't have much of a relationship with China. In the 1990s, starting the mid-1990s, we began to normalize economic relations with China without prejudice to each other's territorial claims on what remains a contested border. We signed 4 agreements between 95 and about 2005 or 2007, which agreed to a certain protocol to manage the border without conceding each other's claims. Okay. So patrolling rights and so on and so forth. What happened in 2020 was China tore up all 4 agreements and placed troops, eventually 100,000 troops, in locations where they were not supposed to be there. They were supposed to come, patrol, and go back. They ended up staying there because they mobilized, we also mobilized. We don't have 100,000 troops up there right now, but we have, I imagine, 60 or 70,000. Not very far away from each other. Accidents can happen, and one did happen in 2020, soldiers died. Post that, we've taken some economic steps to restrict Chinese investments and trade with China. We've banned Chinese apps which are suspected of data mining. But like Europe, like the United States, we cannot completely decouple from China. Nobody can, because China remains a very important part of the global economy.
Ashok, can you keep it brief?
So it's,
Running out of time.
no Indian can ever be brief.
No.
So it's complicated. Coming to the SCO and what we gain out of being in the SCO, frankly, Central Asia, which is the domain of the SCO, is an area of interest for both China and India. And the Central Asian countries want us in the room. They don't want to be just with China.
Okay, let me pose this to the panel as well. What do you do with a problem like Maria? Like Maria, that famous song, Julie Andrews, okay? What do you do with a problem like China? It's like a pill. You can't swallow, and you can't throw it out. Europe is in that position, the US is in that position, we are in that position.
Well, look, I think US history is full of efforts and aspirations for managing the China relationship in ways that the US thought China would go and the way we wanted China to go. It's become very clear that China has not gone that way. That's point one, is there's a real feeling that 150 years of US policy towards China and aspirations towards China has not ended up where we thought it would. Second, I, for one, just speaking for myself, think that Chinese behavior and Chinese actions have been the primary cause of the US turn towards what we call, we'll have a report out shortly, called the hardening US position on China. The third thing I would like to point out is that while we have a very tough strategic competition hardening position on China across the political spectrum, particularly in the United States Congress, you will see that our lines of communication with China remain quite open, as was seen by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan being there last week, et cetera. And I would always remind everyone in the room that traditionally there are 4 quadrants of US relationships in the Indo-Pacific, where we have 5 treaty allies. There is US-China, US alliances, intra-Asia without either US or China, and China's Asia relationships. Until the last 5 years, US-China and US alliances have always been better than China-Asia and intra-Asia relations. Today, what has changed is that the US-China relationship has become much worse, and US alliances have become much better. Where the seam is between the hardening strategic competition on US-China and US alliances, this seam between these two is the following. how far can we go on a hardening US strategic competition with China while managing our strong and fundamental alliances and partnerships, because India is not an ally. And so we are navigating this theme today. And you will see that whether we do a quad or a squad, which includes the Philippines, Japan, the United States, and Australia, or a US, Japan, Korea trilateral arrangement, as we've done at Camp David last year and will resurrect this year, or other alliances, the simple fact is Australia, Japan, India, and other allies have fundamental interest in calibrating and balancing relations with China. They will maintain the US as the default, I firmly believe that, but they will not seek to completely go off sides from China. And you see that happening, in my judgment, in Delhi, to a lesser extent. You certainly see it happening in Tokyo. You see it happening, I was just in Seoul and Tokyo last week. It's happening in Seoul and Tokyo. And even Taiwan has a fundamental debate about how to handle China, as you can see from the split in the legislative yuan of Taiwan and the DPP victory at the presidential level. So all I'm suggesting is that the management of the US-China, you asked, how do you manage this problem? You manage this problem by navigating the seams of your fundamental alliances and partnerships, in the US case, while calibrating a hardening strategic competition with China. And we also cannot de-link with China.
Okay, Gunnar, let me come to you. Same question, but I'll pose it differently. Can there be any multilateral order without China and Russia being part of it? And that is my question. You have SCO, you have BRICS, that is why India participates in all of these. Now, can there be a multilateral order without these two?
Well, that answer is simple, no.
How do we get back to it
The
then?
multilateral order has to comprise all the states and has to make sure that the states would comply with the rules of that order. Let me just say on the China challenge, we have, of course, the same discussions as in the US. We have many moves which are linked to the realistic assessment. Which system is China? Where is it going to? We are dealing with China as a very important economic partner, let's face it, for the US, for Europe, for India. China is a very important economic partner. For us, it is the second most important economic partner after the US. But it is also a competitor in key technologies, and it is a systemic rival. And unfortunately, due to its support for Russia, it's also has become a security threat due to the dual-use exports. This is something which also the Indian side should look at, the support to the Russian war effort, which China does. But let me come back to your question. The need is in all of this to make sure that we reduce vulnerabilities, critical vulnerabilities, and that we therefore engage in what we call de-risking. In this, we have a lot of convergence with the current US administration. We are talking not about decoupling, we are talking about de-risking. If I understand the Indian policy correctly, you're also not decoupling from the Chinese economy, but you want to diminish the risks and vulnerabilities which can be taken advantage of vis-à-vis India. That's what we are engaged in. This is all fully compatible with the existing international system. And we have to see that for China, there is no difference between economic and technology and security, and the various areas are all used to increase influence and impact. And that is something, I think, which has taken time in the US, in India, and Europe to realize, but we are there now. And the key is then to find the right policy mix, which has also the right.
That's a very detailed answer to your question. Okay, let me get to a question. No, there's a question right there. Yes, first.
Thank you very much. I'm Ann Linde. I'm the former Trade and Foreign Minister of Sweden. The last 7 years as minister, I dealt a lot with the Modi government. Now, 3 weeks ago, in opposition capacity, I went to meet the Indian National Congress and Rahul Gandhi and Kharge and so on. And they were so happy for the election result. And they got nearly the same as last time. They get about 22, Modi about 37. But they gained 99 seats, and Modi lost 63 seats in percentage. Are they realistic in being so happy? They think that now they will have an influence over the Indian politics because now Modi and Modi government is down to being a more normal party, not a majority that could do whatever they want. And if so, on the long term, will they change the foreign policy of India if you will have an Indian National Congress government again?
Quick answer, Ashok.
You had two questions. One, yes, Mr. Modi's party lost 63 seats. Mr. Gandhi's party gained, I think, it moved up to 99 from 55, I think 52 or 55. So it gained about 55 seats, so 50 odd seats. Look, does this change things in India? Of course it does. It means that parliament is much more evenly balanced today. So it's like a US president who does not have complete sway over the two houses. So he has to negotiate with the other party. Parliamentary committees become important in terms of shaping laws. So it's more normal in that sense, and it will make for more compromises in terms of policy. But much of the debate in this election was domestic. It was very sharply contested on domestic issues. In terms of India's position in the world, in terms of Indian foreign policy, and in terms of India's global engagement as part of India's economic transformation, which includes access to capital, technology, increasing manufacturing in India, I don't think there are strategic differences between major parties in India. There are tactical differences, different approaches, but I don't think that there's a broad difference in the strategy that India has followed over the past 30 years with successive governments, because there is a vast thread of continuity.
We have a keynote, sorry, I'll come back if you have the time. We have a keynote listener here who has been listening to this debate, listening to your questions, and I think it's also fair that I pass questions over to a mail for a change. Mr. Andras.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm coming from Slovenian Science Foundation, and I'd like to present some occasion we are making, so if you'll let me to tell a few things. Thank you. This year, the Slovenian Science Foundation celebrates its 30th anniversary. In addition to several events that have already taken place and will take place during the celebration year, the Slovenian Science Foundation, on the initiative of the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs and of the Republic of Slovenia, high-tech companies, centers of excellence and research institutes, organized the first Slovenian Indian Day of Science and Innovation on the 6th of February 2024, with the aim of bringing Indian science closer to the Slovenian European public and thus introducing the guests to the brilliant scientists of Slovenia. The rich history of this type of event has seen a number of novelties this year, including science diplomacy, which is by no means a new discipline, but which has gained tremendous importance precisely because of the nature of the most pressing global challenges humanity is facing today. The solutions to which lie primarily in scientific discoveries and innovations, each country can go about addressing similar crises in their own way, and yet when it comes to dealing with similar problems on the international scale, what tends to happen is that a country's foreign policy requires a major refinement of its tools or a whole new set of tools to deal with a world in which the complexity of science and technology is increasing so massively. To build a more equitable world and the current multilateralism that has underpinned international relations since the Second World War, and which is a direct reflection of the political forces of the second half of the 20th century, needs to be reformed in ways to meet expectations of the Global South. And this most certainly includes ensuring fair representation, readdressing historical imbalances, and establishing inclusive decision-making processes. Only in this way can the international community create a system that promotes sustainable development, reduces inequalities, and ensures that the voices of all countries are heard to the fullest extent possible. It is well known that the fact that one of the greatest advocates of the reforming multilateralism is the Indian Prime Minister Modi. So India is certainly one of the main promoters of the process, especially after its successful G20 presidency. The approach it advocates emphasizes intensifying South-South interactions, ensuring the transformation of interdependence to empowerment, unleashing the development power of Global South, where improved access to finance and technology is key, and democratizes the digital transformation that will be a key driver to its economic and governance transition. At last year's G20 summit in India, India brought the hopes and priorities of the Global South even more to the fore. Its desire to globally reshape the financial architecture, increase inclusiveness, also led to the inclusion of African Union to the G20 membership. Disrupting the status quo is high on the India's agenda. It makes no secret, it makes no secret of its desire to empower the Global South through Southern diplomacy, which has been advocated as such as India itself. In the process, it aims to achieve collective success, mutual learning, and shared aspirations. This process framework is based on the domestic priorities decided by the partner countries with which India shares its development journey. The development should be, of course, primarily human-centric, multidimensional, and multi-sectoral. The challenges posed by difficulties in areas such as the economy, health, food, energy, and security, and in particular by major global crises such as the recent pandemic and the rise of conflicts such as terrorism and radicalization in certain areas, require cooperation and joint efforts by all countries of the Global South. This can all be ensured through a fair, inclusive global governance and effective global financial institutions. This cooperation and development partnership has yielded success not only in India, but also elsewhere in the world, and has greatly enhanced the role of India's soft power and cultural values.
Thank you so much. I mean, that really shows how things are changing and what all has happened. We do not actually have the time to go into digital transformations, innovations, all that has been happening. I'm really short of time here, but what I would like to do is come back to the panel briefly for, one question, sorry, last.
Thank you. My question is on, given that this panel is about what kind of a great power India can be, with great power also comes great responsibility, and that we are in Slovenia, and the topic here is on parallel realities. So where do you see, and this question is to Ashok and Gunnar, right, both from as an Indian and from an outside as a European, where do you see the topics of green and gender playing into this aspect of being a great power? Are they important? Are they not important? I would assume you would say they are important, but why and how, I think, would be my questions as well.
Well, I would say they're important enough to have a whole new panel on it also, but so please answer this very briefly.
Look, both are extremely important because before India becomes a great power, India needs to complete or significantly advance its economic and social transformation. Okay? Without that, there's no great power, there's no semi-great power, there's nothing. Now, India's economic transformation calls for industrialization. It calls for industrialization while keeping in mind its net zero commitments, while keeping in mind that it is the first major economy that will industrialize with the pressure of battling climate change and of using renewable energy. and balancing both those imperatives. And if you just look at our cities, you look at our country, you look at the importance of the ecology, it's already hurting us as citizens. You cannot run away from it. In terms of women and gender, quite honestly, if you look at gender participation in our workforce as one metric, it's woefully inadequate. And it's not just that is something we owe to women. Far from that, we owe it to our economy, because without women participating fully in our economy, we will not have the economic transformation that will make us any sort of a power. So those are very much challenges which we have to meet. And I would say the gender challenge is even more important in some respects than the green challenge, because the green challenge, if you ask me, is the reality of that challenge is accepted almost more than the reality of the gender challenge in our society. Perhaps I'm not happy saying that, but it's true.
Gunnar?
Very briefly, green transition is at the core of the changing economy in the European Union, and of course this is also one of the main areas of cooperation with India. We have joined the International Solar Alliance led by India, so there's a key area of cooperation. The gender issues are much more complex, and they form also part of the human rights dialogue between the EU and India, and I would like to recall that India has only human rights dialogues with two partners. One is the United States and one is the European Union, and these are not very how can I say, easy to conduct. More I don't say.
Satu, you have 1 minute to sum up. I'm giving you the task.
India is going to be a much more important international player, and in terms of U.S. interests, India's success is critical to how we think about the future of the 21st century, and we certainly will work with India in every sector that we can to make that happen.
Thank you so much. No, we have no time for any more questions. Let me conclude. Let me conclude by saying that, you're very well aware that this is an election year. We are having major elections across the world. US is going through one. India finished one in June. And what does the Indian election teach you about India? What does it tell you about India? We are an unpredictable country. No one imagined the election results which came out, least of all the ones who were in power. See, India has this habit. The Indian people have this habit when they vote. They like to bring their leaders down a few notches, rub their noses in the ground, make them smell the grass from time to time, and get back to reality. And that is what India is all about. That is what India's diversity makes it. If that makes it leader, let's see. That's for the future. Thank you very much. Give a great hand to my panel here. Oh yes, come.